Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I am your host and moderator for today, Karl Cassell, President and CEO of Horizons, a family service alliance. Reporters and ordinary citizens alike cling tightly to the belief in objectivity because it reassures them, that nothing is being held back, nothing is slanted. The tendency to develop unconsciously biased perception is very human and can be dangerous. It calls for a dose of humility because we hold to the rightness of our story, especially when it's important. According to popular opinion, the media does not fabricate or distort the news. They merely report events, whether beautifully or ugly, as they happen. Objectivity requires that journalists adhere to the principles of independence, fairness, balance, honesty, and courage. They must maintain this stance in the face of growing concentration in the ownership and control of mass communications and brave the wrath of irate politicians or the general public who do not like what they are hearing or reading. So helping us discuss this topic today, the myth of unbiased journalism, we have three guests here on my left. First, Frank Durham, Associate Professor of Journalism and Mass Communications at University of Iowa. Good morning.
Good morning.
In our middle here, we have Joe Scheller, Associate Professor of Communication at Mount Mercy University. Good morning.
Good morning.
And finally, Zack, Kucharski, Executive Editor at the Gazette. Good morning.
Good morning.
And so we'll get right into our questions. First question, just to kind of set the table. Are mainstream news reports balanced and true? And anyone can start.
I think that's one of the things when you ask about what is the mainstream media, you have to stop and pause about that and think of the different ways that news is delivered today.
Yeah.
The way that print news is gathered is somewhat different than the way that online journalism is gathered, and so sometimes there are different methodologies there. I would hope that legitimate media organizations, and I think that that's increasingly difficult to understand what media organizations are in the age of the internet, where an internet connection makes you a publisher. But media organizations traditionally have methods in which they gather news, and so we strive very hard when we're doing that to present what is true at the time. Sometimes just collecting current state in that moment can be difficult. And that goes into where you get multiple perspectives.
Yeah, I think kind of thinking about the question of what do we mean by mainstream media is a very important question, because historically there have been lots of change points in media. The sort of objective traditional media that we know is the late 19th century, early 20th century creation of a time period when print media were growing into very large businesses, and that tradition carried on into broadcasting when it became a large business. And we're seeing another time period of disruptive change where the idea of what media is has shifted a great deal. And as Zack correctly pointed out, anybody that has an internet connection more or less can be a publisher, for better and for worse, and unfortunately sometimes it's for worse. There is a lot of good journalism available, but I think that there's more of a responsibility placed on the consumers of news to understand where that news is actually coming from. And that's I think a bigger challenge in the environment we have now than it certainly has been in the past.
I think it's really difficult to explain sometimes in lay terms, but professionalism in journalism is what we don't get when we get fake news. And being able to recognize the hallmarks of triangulation, comparing sources, verifying sources, and adhering to a professional code of ethics really sets the press and reporters in it apart from the rest of the world who have a keyboard and an internet connection.
Absolutely. I think that those methodologies, it's increasingly complex when you see there are increasing number of events that are meant to kind of distract, figuring out fake news. that triangulation of sources, even in the best of times, you can ask multiple people for their same account of what happened. And there's a pretty significant amount of difference in that. When you go into some of the environment that we're in today, in a polarized climate and into other places, it's straining some of the methodology that we've used in gathering information through the years.
How much control does the owner or the reporter of the news have in the reporting of the news? How much control would you say they have?
How much control does the publisher of the Gazette have over what happens with the Gazette?
I can say in terms of the publisher role and the ownership of media organizations, and I can only speak, my professional career has been at the Gazette, and I can say in my time there's been very little interference. I can't recall a single instance of wanting to influence a story. There are points where the corporate organization gives a donation or something, and we have to work through disclosures. But there's been very little influence. But also to the idea that the person gathering the information, the individual reporter has a great deal of ownership of a story, and they're the first line in terms of asking the questions and gathering information. And so, if you're talking about the ownership interests of very large, in my experience, there's been very little interference, which has been a great thing. However, the Gazette, by its nature, is fairly unique in the media climate that we're an employee-owned newspaper at this point, longtime family-owned, currently employee-owned, and so that's pretty unique in the landscape today.
Well, I think you're also getting at an interesting point about objectivity, because when you are the person who gets to hire the staff and you're making certain decisions implicitly. And when reporters cover stories, they, of necessity, include certain information and exclude other points. And they are operating according to what Todd Gitlin, a media sociologist at Columbia University, calls tacit little theories. So there's not the explicit intention to craft a story in one direction or another, left or right, for example, but there are choices that are made about what gets into the news and what doesn't get into the news. And before that, choosing the person who makes those choices is part of it. So I think when we, many years at Thanksgiving dinner, I've explained that there are different meanings produced in the news that are cultural and even ideological, but there's no conspiracy.
Yeah, the idea that there is a thing, even the term mainstream media, the way we think about it, is sometimes limited. It's true that from a business point of view, there's been a lot of consolidation in the media universe at large, and that there are fewer companies owning larger pieces of the media, but the media as a system is still incredibly big and diverse and isn't a single thing. There's a big difference between the Gazette and other newspapers. The Des Moines Register operates in a different kind of universe, and I think that culturally, one of the things that we've done in recent years that I think is unfortunate is we tend to shortchange that diversity and think of media as an it when the word is supposed to be a plural they.
Well, even in your example, we were talking about the Gazette and the Register. Those are two traditional print outlets. That doesn't even get into broadcast or into the internet outlets that are increasingly part of the collective media.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about media literacy, apart from the production side or the educational side of media, one thing that we don't talk a lot about is the responsibility of news consumers to have a varied diet. You would no more live on one kind of food and be healthy than on one source for your news. And I mean, not to work too hard on the fake news idea, but if Hillary Clinton's running a child prostitution ring out of a pizzeria, you'd think you'd see it in more than one outlet and get different versions of the story. So this diversity is a plus. It's a positive thing, and I think the richer the diet, the better.
I agree, and I think that that the discouraging thing was that fake news was more consumed on the internet in the 3 months leading up to the election than the real news, and that's a troubling trend. And I think that that consumer knowledge of media and just that awareness is more critical than ever.
Right, there's a certain bias in the consumer that is troubling and helps direct media choice sometimes. There's the concept that one of the reasons we have a First Amendment and the kind of media system we have is that we want the marketplace of ideas versus what the internet sometimes creates, which there's a diversity of potential sources that you might consult, but the reality is that the way that a lot of people use that tool is that they're more in walled gardens than they are in a marketplace, that it's easy to segment your choices to exist in your own echo chamber.
I think that President Obama really hit on that thread in his final speech in Chicago last week, where he talked about needing to acknowledge differing ideas and that data and different pieces matter, and that if you only identify with your own thinking, that increasingly makes compromise in the political system ineffective. And I think that the same is true if you only think on one piece of if you only have one thing in your diet, you're not well-rounded as a consumer.
Well, that suggests to me a real key difference between traditional print news and the online presentation of the news. Because when I read the Gazette every morning, which I do with my espresso and bran,
and thank you,
I browse, and when I turn the page, I come face to face with stories I would not necessarily have selected from a menu. But when I read it online, it's algorithmically driven, and I'm served stories that are like the ones I looked at the last time. And so there is a sort of technological difference in the diet we get out of the news, and it's one to be aware of.
Absolutely, and I think that that's one of the trickiest ones to understand, because you don't necessarily see the algorithm that's making the choice for you.
You don't see what you're not getting to.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly, yeah, true.
So if everyone disclosed their political biases, would we see an even greater degree of what's been called media compartmentalization? And are we getting closer to this reality?
I think you were hinting at echo chambers, but with your walled garden metaphor, I think we are increasingly drawn more to ourselves and to like-minded thinking, and I think that's a shame, because the democracy depends on a certain kind of friction.
It also depends, I think, on a certain flexibility of mind. And I don't object to somebody being open and describing whatever bias they think is inherent within their thinking, but on the other hand, I don't think everything now that I thought 10 or 20 years ago. And it is one of the interesting odd attributes of the online world that we live in, that anybody anywhere can record anything that anybody says, and then it can reside on the internet, and the internet never forgets. And we sort of, if we demand that everybody declare a political identity, it sort of locks them in a way that I find somewhat discomforting. I know that when I was a working journalist, I would have been very uncomfortable with talking with a politician about what my opinion was or my bias was. I certainly paid enough attention to events that I had opinions, but I didn't want those to drive my reporting. And so I guess I'm sort of split on that question that you ask. I mean, I sort of like openness and transparency and declaring what you are, but what you are is not a fixed thing.
Certainly.
And any thinking person, we hope, changes over time, and I think that tendency to want people to declare, I worry that it fits into my walled garden metaphor in a way.
I think that works as long as you're willing to acknowledge multiple points of view, and you to allow that change to naturally occur. I think we're in a period of time where there's increasingly debate about what is a fact, and having a common set of facts is a common starting point is increasingly difficult, and so I think that I'm with you. I think that there's a real danger in terms of if there is just compartmentalization, there's some diversity of thought is good, but you have to be willing to compromise on some of those thoughts and look at it from multiple points of view.
But I think the word bias can be problematic as well, because the implication of the term bias is that there's an absolute truth from which people are knowingly varying. And I think that if we set that aside in favor of the idea that journalism is, among other things, produces culturally based social knowledge, then it gets slipperier, but it's more useful, because that's where you get your diversity. And that's where you can you can ask questions about the values behind the construction or the framing of news. You can ask about what got left in, what got left out, and how one version of a story at ABC is different from NPR, is different from the Gazette, and begin to look at the shades and degrees of meaning and recognize that it's a very fluid and competitive information marketplace.
And again, that takes, as a consumer, you have to be consuming multiple points of view, but that diversity, I mean, one of the most dangerous bias, especially when you're coaching a young reporter, is the unasked question. It's impossible to gather the information if you never ask for it, and that's a problem. And then that, goes even beyond. You can extend that much further into asking for differences, understanding context, understanding history. If you're only looking at the instance that second versus over time, I mean, there's all sorts of chances, and that goes to the idea that you're making thousands of decisions in the gathering of information.
Sure, and the news consumer is really charged with doing the work of democracy, which is complicated, which requires education, which is sometimes unlikely in a comparative sense. It's Walter Lippmann certainly didn't have a lot of faith in the average American's ability to make sense of complicated news. He was not a populist, and I'm not sure he would be wrong today. But the most important part of journalism may be the way readers and viewers take it.
Right.
You've all mentioned at some point online journalists and media. So having so many new and well-connected online journalists reporting from places all over the globe, does it create a power shift in journalism or in reporting, do you think?
Well, Zack, you're the current editor, so you can talk about this, but I'm thinking about my days of editing and reporting were in the 80s and 90s, and when I was in journalism school, we talked a lot about the gatekeeping function of the media and how a local newspaper or TV station or whatever the news outlet was partly was responsible for the agenda of the events that were water cooler talk, and that's shifted a lot to trying to understand what's important in the cacophony. What are the events that you should tune into, because there's all kinds of stuff there, but what's the real stuff, what's the fake stuff? What comes to you from somebody who knows what they're talking about versus somebody that's pushing a particular agenda or point of view, and the role of the consumer of news and the purveyor of news has been profoundly changed by that online environment. Even who, we talk about a term that we never had before, the citizen journalist. And news outlets like the Gazette sometimes think about how they can help guide a conversation. Is that part of what you're thinking about these days?
Absolutely. I mean, and just even to the point that you're making about the different platforms of the news cycle, where that instantaneous release of information, I mean, that determines where it goes in the search rankings, and that presents in itself a challenge for the consumers. You can, if you're quick to hit publish and you get crawled quickly, you're at the top of the Google results, whether you're a news organization or not, depending on how much traffic your site gets. That's one of the challenges in combating fake news. If your site's popular, how do you get that out of the search results? And as a consumer, how do you know that? But in terms of, online has changed things a lot, because there's a thinking of, okay, be quick with the information, get it out there, let it evolve, let it breathe a little bit differently. Usually by the time in the cycle, by the time the newspaper comes out, you've had a little bit more time to reflect on it and polish it. By nature, what we do, you're gathering it as it's happening. And so as you start to figure out how much time's elapsed, I mean, the story is usually evolving.
Breaking news isn't really the friend of the fact. I mean,
Nope.
Frank, you brought up Walter Lippmann, who is one of America's most respected journalists. He wrote in 1922 that news and truth are not the same thing and must be clearly distinguished. The function of news is to signalize an event. The function of truth is to bring light to the hidden facts, to set them in relation with each other and make a picture of reality. Do journalists still reveal truth that was once hidden based on their extensive investigation on a matter?
I think they do, but I mean the relationship between news and fact, for example, is Lippmann was concerned that the journalists should be able to construct a social meaning at the expense of the individual. He didn't want people to live in their own bubbles, and in the internet age we have reproduced that. He talked about the pictures in our heads, and he coined the term stereotypes. And he thought that the news could give us a commonly agreed upon narrative of reality so that we could find ourselves socially in that context. And so he felt that the only chance that the individuals had to participate in democracy was to have a commonplace constructed by journalism within which they could know each other.
Anyone else want to comment on truth, revealing truth?
Well, the old saying is that journalism is a first draft of history, and I guess it's important to keep in mind that all first drafts need to be revised a lot. And I think it is sometimes true that the way in which an event is first reported colors the perspective that people have from that point onward, and sometimes makes it difficult to sort of back away from the term, the narrative, that a bias or particular point of view sort of attaches to something, and it's hard to unstick it from that. I think that our recent political campaigns have sometimes had some examples of that. I mean, think of Howard Dean and that cry that he gave in Iowa, and how that's the tape from that campaign that gets played over and over again, as if that had some larger meaning. And yes, that's the thing that's sort of attached to him.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, just to go back to Lippmann and the idea of what truth was for him, he was a pragmatist. And so he regarded journalism as a daily exercise that was imperfect, but it was the best we had. And so the constant re-reporting and re-presentation of facts as news was not to achieve an ideal, but to pursue it. And that's why when reporters do their work, they as professionals, they share their sources, they indicate the difference between sources, they triangulate, and anyway, that's
well, I think, building on that, as we go into more and more online, the more that you are transparent and you link those sources together in a way that people can see how that information came together, I think that adds to your credibility. And so I think you'll start to see, good news organizations are already doing that, and I think that is going to continue to build.
Sure, and part of the professionalism that he worked on 100 years ago was turning being wrong into a virtue, running the correction, explaining that we know the difference, explaining that we got it wrong and we can tell. And so, that's another sort of pragmatic value that he brought to journalism, which we still practice.
Well, and I think the more that an organization is willing to acknowledge that, the quicker they're able to respond in the climate today. We do a lot of just part of my role is going out and building sources and talking to them about how we do what we do and why we do what we do. And the more that people understand what we do and how we're doing it, I think that builds a better relationship and a better discussion of some of the issues. As long as both sides are willing to engage.
Sure.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and so I want to bring up Walter Cronkite and his tagline each night used to be, and that's the way it is. Could news journalists get away with saying something like that now? You bring up it's facts are not necessarily fixed, and so, or history, or when something is reported, it's not necessarily fixed in time. That's the way it is. Could we get away with that today?
Well, Cronkite was in a unique time period when his organization was extremely important in terms of reporting the news, and so we don't have any voices that are quite like Cronkite now. Certainly somebody could say something like that, but that is, I like what you said about the sort of the objectivity and truth being an ideal worth pursuing, that we know, you don't get it right the first time, but you have to have the flexibility to keep going back and triangulate. The fact that you don't know the fact doesn't mean that there isn't a fact. Right.
And the ability to construct facts is the basis, at least, for sorting out different positions, belief systems that otherwise might not know each other at all.
Well, even at a practical level, that statement came when people sat down and made an appointment to watch the news each night. Sure. There are way more than 3 network news outlets these days, and so just the way that it is, it changes by the second.
I think there's a certain good aspect to the diversity and even fragmentation of the news, because when there were 3 networks, a lot of people didn't get heard.
Right.
A lot of voices were never heard, and so now we have this cacophony, we have this kaleidoscopic media environment. I would just make a pitch and a plea for professional journalism as a source of the closest thing we've got to truth.
Mm-hmm. I would echo that.
And I would agree with your point too, that there is, well, certainly there's problems with the current media environment, but the idea that voices that couldn't be heard before can be heard is one of the most important pluses.
It really is.
Well, we're pretty much out of time. I certainly appreciate the views that you guys have expressed today, the in-depth knowledge and understanding that you have of the media. I hope our viewers at home are able to digest some of this and use it as they now consume the news. And so we won't be able to totally exhaust the issue, and we never are. The answer is brain training to prepare for this intra-intellect warfare. Mindfulness in acknowledging our experience and building resiliency to the emotional pitfalls that feed the drive are the answers. It is evidence-based. It's an evidence-based approach to the scenario happening all around us. Please be intentional in your consumption of information and research as much as you can to form your own perspective. We thank you for joining us today. Please tune in again next week on another episode of Ethical Perspectives on the News. Good day.